This is Van Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air. Do you want to be referred to as Dr. Samantha Harte or Samantha Harte?
I mean, I'm not upset about the doctor in front.
Yeah. With the doctors, some people they have preferences, but thank you for being on the Fan Electric Ghost podcast. How you doing tonight?
I'm great. I love coming on podcasts, so I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, so this is the first time we're talking to you, and you're a physical therapist, an author, performing artist, podcast host, and like you have a lot of hats, and so we're going to talk about your story. But before we get into your story, I ask every guest on the show, I ask a couple questions. What motivates you, and why do you do what you do?
I'm in the business of saving lives, and the amount of grief I have lived through has given me a sense of urgency about my life. So when I wake up, I'm inherently motivated because I know how short and precious our time here on earth is.
So the life lessons brought you to where you are today and what you're doing as a therapist and as a podcaster.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I think the reason I wear so many hats is because my life lessons have made it very clear I'm not one thing, I'm many things. And there are so many tendrils coming out of me, like spokes on a wheel, that are facilitators in how I can help. So, physical therapy is one of the vehicles by which I can help somebody, but also sober life coaching, also through the hard conversations on my podcast and storytelling about how I got through my hardest things, also through the messages of my book. I think there are so many ways we can reach people and be of service. And I feel much truer to my nature that I'm doing it in a handful of ways today.
So you're kind of at the intersection of like mind, body, health, and wellness, and also in terms of people's like mental health. The books you wrote, was that like the first thing you got into, or were you doing like the therapy and like what's the timeline on all the different hats you have?
Yeah. I mean, when I was young, I wanted to be a star. So I love to sing and dance. That only got so far before the rejection of that industry took its toll on me. And when I say took its toll on me, I mean, I had no ability to handle rejection. I really ran my life for a very long time seeking external validation from everyone and everything outside of me. And academia was a highly controlled environment. It was also the place my mom said I should stick around in and get a degree in because it was a surefire way to a stable life. I mean, the big joke about that is I didn't look at any of the fine print on all the loans I signed, and I went to school for $100,000 and came out making 60, right? So I started wanting to be an artist, and then I quickly had a raging drug and alcohol problem, played it very safe and went to school. And for a long time, just did physical therapy and maybe a little bit of dancing on the side. It really wasn't until the last couple of years where I sort of busted through the creative door again and wrote my book, started making music again, started my podcast, and really embraced both sides of the brain and
You're right.
right and
Yeah.
did all these things that I think were always there, but it just wasn't the right timing for me until now to pursue them.
Yeah, I find there's like a lot of creative people I talk to is like different points in their lives that give themselves the permission structure to actually dive into what their passions are. A lot of times you can have that in early childhood. You can be like, kind of a phenom. You're doing the music. You think you're going to be all that, and then you start getting hit with the real world. Like not everybody. Like in my kind of frame, I'm a child of the '70s. Like, oh, if if I'm not kicking out like Parliament Funkadelic or like Sun Ra or the Miles Davis or what, like I'm not really gonna make it. But I always felt like I like to do music because I like it, because I love it. So I never stopped. Right.
Mm,
Whether I was making money with it wasn't the point. It was the point. I just love playing piano. I love
mm,
playing keyboards. And so I never stopped. And I knew a lot of people my age, they were like, they have guitars and they're sitting in the closet, sitting in the basement, never picked them up again because they
mm,
didn't hit some perceived goal of like, oh, you got to hit this or then just give up.
mm.
Did you
Yeah,
ever run into that, the kind of thing?
that's interesting because I always loved it. So I never stopped loving it. But my hardwiring for perfectionism really won out
Mm,
over the absolute volatility of the entertainment industry. And I do believe that what you love, once you become awake and aware about how you're living your life, what you love will find you again
mhm,
if you have abandoned it. And for me, it was honestly, well, at least it felt like a matter of, in some ways, spiritual life or death. The idea of trying to be a star while also pleasing my mother, while also not believing in God, while also having an unrelenting inner critic living inside of me, while also having a raging cocaine addiction did not work. And
mhm,
I couldn't function in that environment in any capacity. So what was so much more accessible was to just play it safe and go back to school.
mhm,
So it wasn't as simple as I loved it, and it was the love of it that stayed at the forefront for me and not the money or the fame. It was like I loved it, but I didn't love myself.
yeah, it's got the core issue you run into, when I've talked to a lot of people on the podcast, is like you can't love anybody else or move forward in your life if you don't love yourself. If you don't solve your own your own issues with like that looking glass self, you look in the mirror, and if the vulnerability causes you to like insulate yourself with safety mechanisms, which could be different types of addictions or things, because the problem with being an artist is vulnerability is your secret sauce, but it's a double-edged sword because
Hmm.
like if you take it real hard when you don't hit where what your perceived goal is, and that really hurts, and you can't find a way to recover, then
Yep,
you like medicate or you push it down or you don't get to self-actualize because you've got the safety mechanism. You're running from the wolf, and the wolf might
exactly.
be in the mirror. The wolf at the
Ex-
door is like you.
Indeed. Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's complicated. It's fascinating, really.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to deal with is when you actually start to address, that looking glass self and you start to realize like there's this kind of crucible moment I've run into with different folks I've talked to, like it's kind of this critical mass. It's like,
Mm.
are we gonna keep, doing this loop, or are we gonna get beyond that loop?
Hmm. Yeah, I have so much to say about that. I mean, when I made the decision to just trudge forward and get the degree and play it safe, if you will, I went away to college, got a degree in communications halfway through my sophomore year. And I was a straight A student, such a nerd in school. But again, I was addicted to control before I was addicted to any substance. And so getting a straight A was like a hit of dopamine to me.
Hmm.
And I had this professor who would not give me anything other than a C. And what I did was plagiarize, the one and only time in my whole life. And I was surrounded by peers that had plagiarized their way into college, that plagiarized all through college, right? Here I am so desperate not to fail. And I get caught. I end up getting an 18-month suspension from the university, and the amount of shame that I had, that my mother had over that. What I did on the heels of that incident is say, I'm going to tell myself and everybody else's story that now I'm going to move back to New York and be a star. I took a year off from school to see what would happen, right? And at the same time, when I think about it in hindsight, that's also when my drinking and drugging really took off. So it makes a lot of sense. I had been dabbling in it for years up until that point, but it was such a thing on the side. It was so highly controlled up until this time. And I remember moving to New York City, being like, watch out, world. Here I come. Britney Spears, move over. I'm taking your stage. And in order to survive living in New York City at 21 years old, I bartended like many good creatives do. And then the more I drank behind the bar, the drunker I got. And the more I saw the cocaine dealer at the end of the bar giving me a wink, and I would just do a little coke and be leveled back out, lather, rinse, repeat. All while trying to audition, teaching dance at really prestigious places, and part-time going back to school to get my degree in communications, because it was just random and broad enough to feel like I could fit inside of. So I was straddling between these two worlds of who I really was as an artist and who I knew how to be as an academic. And I remember feeling just exhausted by the rejection of the industry. And again, I had no ability to self-soothe internally, zero at this point in my life. And I decided to pursue getting into a doctoral program for PT. And that felt so safe. And obviously my mother loved the idea of me being a doctor. And on the day I was accepted into my doctoral program, I overdosed on cocaine. That is how I was living my life. You know, the idea of work hard, play hard actually meant beat yourself to a pulp until you're perfect. Mm-hmm. Then to tame that critical voice inside of you that's going to say it wasn't good enough anyway. Drink and do drugs until you cannot feel a thing anymore. That's how I lived. And up until that moment, I was getting away with it. I mean, I got into graduate school, for God's sakes, living like that. You know, I had an apartment in Manhattan. I had multiple jobs. I had a boyfriend. So I was running on these patterns, but they were working for me. Even the overdose wasn't the end of this pursuit of external validation. In fact, it would take many, many more years, well into my sobriety, before, as you just said, I hit that critical mass. I hit what I call spiritual rock bottom, which is a place where you don't want to die, but you can no longer go on living the way that you're living. And the thing about addiction, you know, it's so elusive. And to the people who aren't addicts, they have such a hard time understanding this. And it's part of why I'm so impassioned about speaking about it. I had a physical bottom, if you will, right? I mean, I almost lost my life. I did cocaine the next day off of my sister's fingernail. That is how woven into a cycle of addiction, not just I was, but my family unit was. That's how normalized it was for me. That's how little I was willing to let it go, because yes, that was becoming a problem, clearly, but I could check all the cultural boxes about how good I still had it. Why was I going to give up the whole way in which I behaved and coped just because of this one thing? I'll just get this one thing under control, and the rest of how I live can stay intact. I remember going to a meeting and listening to those 12 steps, and they just came up against every childhood belief that kept me safe. You know, my mom was a raging atheist. She was like, the people who believe in God are absolute fools, and the only person you can count on is yourself. Now I'm coming into the rooms and they're like, you got to get down with God. And if you don't, good luck staying sober. And I'm like, well, this sucks because I have a drug issue and I probably need to get sober, but I can't do any of these other things because actually those things felt wildly unsafe based on what I learned as a young girl. So I did what good addicts do. And I never went to another meeting again for 1.5 years and changed my cocaine use to, benzodiazepines, and eventually never had anything as scary as an overdose happen again. But the guy I was dating found this prescription pill bottle that my father was driving into Manhattan and giving to me whenever I wanted that was not prescribed to me. And he looked at me with so much disgust that I was still secretly using behind his back. And I went back to a meeting. Still wasn't ready to give up the way I lived, all the patterns and the coping mechanisms, but I was afraid, talk about external validation, that this guy's going to leave me. I was like, I can't afford that because if he leaves me, I'm nothing and I'm no one. So I guess I kind of have to do this 12-step thing. I don't really know. And this guy took me through the steps. I loved him. He was a friend of mine before he was my sponsor. He had 22 years sober from heroin addiction. He had seemingly recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body. I mean, it was like people could say whatever they wanted to say in the rooms. I didn't believe it. I wanted nothing to do with it. But when Bobby spoke, I believed it. I told him I hated God. I couldn't get down with it. He's like, don't worry, honey. Just borrow my faith until you have some of your own. He lit the way for me, and I worked the steps the best that I could in that first year. And I mean, I got to the point where, I was now sober, finishing up graduate school, felt like my life was opening up again to some extent. I go to California. I was living in New York and I had this chance to check out LA. Maybe I would do PT out here. Also, I could dance out here. It sounded kind of intriguing. I come out here. Bobby was acting weird leading up to that. Couldn't put my finger on it. And I remember saying to him, I don't know what's going on with you. I love you. We were friends before anything else. Let's just go back to being friends. I'll find a temporary sponsor out here in California. I come out here. I'm getting auditions. I mean, things with dance are starting to move. And I'm almost finishing PT school. I want to tell him. I want to call him and tell him everything. And he never picked up his phone. And eventually his wife picked up and said, Sam, Bobby relapsed. I don't know what to tell you. You can come and meet up with him in person when you get back. That's why he's not answering his phone. I mean, remember, right? I'm 1 year sober. I'm hanging on by a thread. I'm not really working a program. The only faith I actually have is in Bobby. And now he relapsed. So I'm thinking, this is impossible. He's going to tell me something that's going to make sense of this. I'm just going to wait till I see him and not worry about it until then. And we met up in Manhattan. And I just remember feeling like I was in the presence of a ghost. It was as if somebody went behind his eyes and just blew the light out. That spirit, that essence that makes a person uniquely who they are was dead, even though his physical body was still alive. It was so spooky to me. And I didn't know anything about addiction. I really didn't on a spiritual level. And I just remember feeling so afraid and I couldn't get an answer out of him. And he couldn't just say, yes, I relapsed. He couldn't look me in the eye. It was just a bunch of excuses. It was like a different person. I met up with him one more time after that and then just decided I need space because it was too scary. And I think I was afraid of my own relapse since he was the one person I could trust and count on. And then he killed himself. At this time in my life, I'm 1 year sober. And my sponsor commits suicide after 22 years sober. Did I actually put my hands up and surrender and say, God, I'm willing to do the work now? I'll do whatever it takes. I can't die. Nope. What I said was, if I use drugs or alcohol again, I'm dead. And I don't want to die, but I'll be fucking damned if I work those 12 steps in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I lived off of the pattern of becoming what everyone else wanted me to be loved, pleasing and perfecting and performing until there was nothing left of me for the next 4 years. It was not until a marital crisis that took me to my knees that I hit bottom and surrendered. The guy that found that prescription pill bottle was my boyfriend at the time. He became my fiance when we moved to LA, and now he was my husband. And he started pulling away. And I don't mean pulling away a little. I mean rejecting me sexually, not sharing our finances, going on business trips all the time, leaving his ring at home. I mean, I was out of my mind, accusing, begging, pleading for him to forgive me again, to go to therapy with me. Are you fucking cheating on me? Just tell me the truth. I don't know what to tell you, Sam. You're the cheater. Because I had cheated on him a zillion times in my active addiction. And like a good codependent, he stayed. Right? So I'm thinking, I must be crazy. This is my fault. This is what I get for what I did. When I tell you the level of trying to control something and someone that I couldn't drove me to insanity, I'm telling you the truth. I eventually moved out because my well-being was so compromised. I slept on couches. What I thought would be a couple weekends away from my husband was months and months and months and months, until finally a sober friend was like, you need to sign a lease and get your own place. You need to heal, because if you're not going to leave your marriage, you cannot live like this. That was bottom. That was the window of opportunity where I didn't want to die, but I could no longer go on living the way that I was living.
So you've gone through all these extremities, like because of your, like, it seems like the perfection mindset was very destructive for you, and then maybe the control aspects of trying to control maybe things that you can't control, and learning to let go, or learning to kind of adapt. I've always, one lesson I've always tried to teach people when I'm working as a producer is the idea of that imperfection is the nature of art. And sometimes people who are trying to be too perfect, they kind of wreck their art, because there's something about allowing things to be. But if you can't see that, then it's hard to ingrain that in somebody if they can't see it, if they can't feel it, if they can't experience it for themselves, if they've been stuck in that loop of trying to be perfect or people pleasing, and they just don't know how to recover from the bad note,
Yep.
or the perceived mistake. But at some point that you start to give yourself some grace, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky in my story, in the sense that I think so many addicts in particular, because the nature of an addict is, you use, and then that thing you're using isn't enough anymore, and you kind of up level what you're using. The things you say you'll never do, you actually do, and they become more dangerous and they can kill you. And so many addicts die before they hit spiritual rock bottom, which is the place they need to get to invite in real change. I think I didn't die because Bobby's suicide scared the shit out of me.
Like a scared straight type of moment.
Uh-huh. Only from physical substance though, right? Not from the behavioral patterns. When I was in that apartment in my separation, this woman walked into my life who was in multiple 12-step programs, not just AA. And she said, what if we do the steps on your marriage? And all of a sudden, my head cocked to the side, like, that sounded so good to me. So what does that mean, right? In recovery, a traditional step one is I'm powerless over alcohol. My life has become unmanageable, or insert the substance of choice, right? Think about being 4, 5, 6, 10, 15, 20 years sober. That's not as helpful as the crisis you're in and rearranging the language to match it. I'm powerless over my marriage. I'm powerless over that we rushed into it, that we didn't separate or get therapy beforehand, that there's a lot of repercussions for what happened on the front end, that my husband is pulling away. I'm powerless over whether he'll ever forgive me. I'm powerless over whether he'll stay my husband or be the father of my future children. And when I try to exert power over him, my life becomes unmanageable in the following ways. And I list that out, right? And I start to see it for what it is. I start to see these old coping mechanisms for what they're doing to me. And then I go, well, if that's all true, what do I have power over in my current life situation, right? And so we went through the steps like that, and we got to the 9th step, which is making an amends. And I had made so many amends. 5 years sober, there were plenty of people before and in recovery that I had hurt, that I had not just said I was sorry to, but who I tried to amend my behavior toward, right? To be a different person to them. And yet no one ever, until this moment in my life, I was 30 years old, said to me, have you ever made an amends to yourself? This was so critical to a perfectionist who never let herself off the hook for anything, who even when she looked great and did well in school was never enough, never smart enough, never pretty enough. There wasn't even a possibility that I could forgive myself for some of the things I had done, especially the hurt I caused to my now husband. Why does that matter, right? This was the moment my life changed course. This was the beginning of me understanding that perhaps I had made 1,000 bad choices, especially in my addiction, but that I was not a bad person. And if that is true, and I'm a good person who made bad choices, then do I deserve this shitty marriage that I'm in? It was like somebody unfogged the glasses and I could see my life for what it was, not for what it used to be or what I was wishing and praying in the future it would become. When he finally forgave me, when I give all my power away. But actually, if I deserve something big and beautiful, and that's not what I'm getting, what do I want? And what is the next right decision from here? And the amazing thing about beginning this practice of more compassionate self-talk, because boy, was it a practice, right? I mean, my inner critic would show up and say, here comes another shitty day because of all the shit you did. I'd wake up in that apartment totally depressed. My husband's living some other life. I don't know if he's cheating on me. I don't know if we're miserable. And the inner critic would just raging. I would have to interrupt her and go, oh my God, if I am a person who deserves love and deserves forgiveness, what would a kinder part of me say instead of that? I would have to interrupt and practice, right? What that might sound like and feel like. And what ended up happening is I finally heard my intuition. Now I know it was my intuitive voice. I didn't really know at the time. I just knew it was a part of me that was much kinder. I mean, she didn't sound anything like my perfect voice. She was calm and curious and compassionate. And I felt like, talk about being straight out of choices. I knew what my life looked like when I followed the critical voice. She took me straight headfirst into the ground, into a pit of despair. So I could choose her again. I could listen to whatever she said for the day and go by that. But I knew where that story ended, and I wasn't interested in being miserable anymore. And I couldn't relapse, because if I relapsed, I was going to die. So I had nothing to lose by honoring the whisper of my intuition. She would make little suggestions and I would just try them. And then she would make bigger suggestions and I would try those. And I suddenly was accumulating a bunch of wins, and when I say wins, I mean something really cool would happen that allowed me to build up a sense of self-worth. You cannot build worthiness if a voice inside your head is constantly telling you you're a piece of shit. But if there's another part of you that you can gain access to because you have a way to clear your shame, is saying, hey, next time you feel really sad, instead of beating yourself up, why don't you just wrap your arms around yourself? I know that's kind of awkward and weird, but why don't you just try that? And then I would try it. I would get through the hard thing. I would feel better. And I would gain a sense of pride. I'm talking about wins like that. And also external wins, right? Like, oh shit, you're kind of broke without your husband's support. Yeah, you're a doctor, but you're only making $33 an hour. You might want to see if you can build a business here on the side. You're really good at training people. And now you have a doctorate. What if you're a doctor that trains people instead of a trainer who trains people? Why don't you try to ask people if they want that service? So I did, and they did. And I started to make money from my own intuition nudging me in that direction. You better believe that built up confidence and worthiness, right? So my life, spiritually speaking, began in my marital crisis.
So I guess sometimes what happens, like when you find you're kind of, you get out of the doldrums of life and you start to have a growth mindset. Sometimes with the law of attraction, the people that you were around before don't fit the frequency you're on now. So I guess my question is, like, once you were in the right place, what did the law of attraction kind of bring to you?
I mean, here's one cool way to answer that, right? So I start my own business, which is still in existence to this day, called Strong Heart Fitness. At the time, it was just about the physical body, right? And now I do much more than that when I coach people, because I have a book that talks about the spiritual side of wellness. So my work now is very integrative and comprehensive. But at the time, it was just physical. And I remember sharing with my clients, my excitement about what I was trying to do and how I wanted to be the person bridging the gap between when insurance discharges you and where you actually want to be, right? Because all of a sudden I'm looking around the healthcare landscape going, this sucks. I got out of school to help people. I'm treating people's symptoms. I'm not getting to the source of the problem. I'm not treating whole body, whole person. They're getting discharged. They're 60% better, but they want to be 100% better. Let me be that person, right? So I start to come up with this big vision of a one-stop shop for health and wellness, right? A place where people could come and do the kind of work I was offering. They could also get acupuncture and psychotherapy. And I share it with this client. At some point, I mean, I did not know them for very long. I worked with them for less than 6 months. They said, we want to invest in your idea. And they did. They did. And I expanded into a much larger space that was 9 blocks away from the Pacific Ocean in Santa Monica, So you want to talk about changing your frequency.
Yeah, that's a real example.
I don't share that part of my story a lot because, my story is robust and there's so many parts of it that I can share on these podcast interviews, but that's an amazing moment that happened.
That's kind of like the whole purpose of the law of attraction, is because when you're on the right frequency, I'm a Buddhist, but the idea, like if you're in the right frequency, then the people kind of align to your frequency. So opportunities will happen because they get in your field of view, and suddenly this person actually was in sync with where you wanted to go, and at that moment, you know, that aligned, and then you are where you are, because that was, we would believe is like, that was supposed to happen, because that's at that moment, that's where you were, and it was in the right alignment for that to happen. So it makes a lot of sense from my perspective that that could happen. But other
Absolutely.
things, if you stay on that direction, then it will continue to happen,
Yep.
because that's like why you find your tribe when you're out there, right? And you're giving of yourself, and then people see it, and you're being vulnerable, you're being open, you're being authentic. People that resonates, the authenticity of it resonates with people, and then they say, "Whoa, this person, I can jump on this train. This makes a lot of sense to me." You know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I wish, the story of that was such that it went on to be a franchise and a multi-million-dollar business, and in the spirit of honoring the call of my intuition, I got pretty close to the vision at one point, though it wasn't exactly the original plan, because instead of having a bunch of employees underneath my brand doing these different modalities, I ended up becoming, which was amazing to drive down my overhead costs, but a glorified landlord. I didn't think so much like a businesswoman at the time. And so somebody would come and find my space, and it was beautiful, and they'd say, "Can I rent from you?" I had extra space, right? So I'm like, sure. Before I know it, I have 5 people renting from me. I'm paying almost nothing in rent. And everyone's doing these amazing things: podiatry, psychotherapy, like I said, pelvic floor PT, acupuncture. And I'm like, oh my God, this is a one-stop shop. And yet it wasn't growing my brand. It wasn't part of Strong Heart Fitness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it was really good for a while. And, as I'm gaining time in sobriety, I started really noticing, because, there's this whole crossover from physical to emotional sobriety. And you can't stay physically sober unless you become emotionally sober, right? Which means your mindset needs to be washed and rinsed daily, so that you don't eventually fall back into a physical relapse. So I'm doing a lot of work on myself as I'm gaining time sober. To put it in perspective, my husband was cheating on me. Okay. And I found that out after I moved back in with him, thinking we were doing better. I find out he'd been having a 5-year extramarital affair on and off before I even got sober, that crossed over into our marriage. I moved out again after I found out, filed separation, had sex with every human on earth I possibly could, was like, fuck you, right? And eventually took him back, because that's what my intuition was suggesting I might want to do if I thought that maybe we could have a happy life on the other side of this mess, right? I'm talking about trudging through sobriety, overcoming a betrayal that thick, trying for babies and having miscarriages, getting postpartum depression. And I'm running a clinic, and I'm going, God damn it, all these people coming in here, they're not addicts. These people are paying me cash to do physical therapy. They're ordinary folk, high net worth, and yet so many of them were stuck in these emotional cycles of dysfunction that had nothing to do with substance abuse, and I called it soul sickness. They were perfectionists that were untreated. They were workaholics. They were stuck in self-righteous anger or martyrdom. And all those things were getting in the way of me curing their knee pain. And I could only meet them where they were at so much, because I'm not a psychologist. It wasn't in the scope of my practice to treat that. But it bothered me. It bothered me that I couldn't get all the way in there. As my husband and I were moving forward and having babies, making a little more money, we were on our feet, we bought our first home, then we were able to sell it, buy a second house, upgrade our lives. We went and thought, wow, maybe we could get a rental home. We went out to Texas 2.5 years ago, and we looked around in Austin. We almost put an offer in on a house. We decided not to. We're in the airport waiting to come back to LA. And I get these text messages incessantly. And I'm hitting, delete and spam. Then I start getting phone calls from the same number, end call, because I'm sure it is a telemarketer. And then I recognize the area code as being from New Jersey, which is where my sister lived. And I was like, oh my God. And it was a woman calling to tell me my sister died of a drug overdose. I come from a family of addicts. I happen to be the cycle breaker, which is amazing and excruciating at the same time. I had been trying to save my sister's life for 2 decades. I did everything right. I did everything wrong. I did everything in between. The last several years, I just became a force of good, a force of light, always ready to extend my hand when she was ready to do the work. And this thing that I was terrified of actually happened. I mean, it's so rare in our lives when the worst case scenario comes to pass. And it did. That day on the plane ride back to LA, I said to my husband, and I don't remember saying this, I'm writing a fucking book. And I did. That was the day that Samantha, the doctor of physical therapy, who loved art but wasn't really doing anything about it, died. I had no idea where I was going or who I was becoming, but I knew that it had to encompass all of me. And it had to address the spiritual side of wellness. The book I ended up writing, Breaking the Circuit, which is out in the world now, is a self-help memoir. So it's all the hardest stories of my life and how I got through them, because I believe there's so much power in that level of vulnerability. When you've crossed over from the wounded side to the healed side, and you can share your hardest things in the hopes that it lifts the shame for someone else and possibly even saves their life, you should do it. But it's not just a memoir. It's prescriptive, because remember, when I worked those 12 steps in a new way, my life changed. So I made sure my book had 12 chapters, and every chapter corresponded to one of the 12 steps, but that I made the steps modern and practical and trauma informed, so that no matter who you are, addict or not, you have a blueprint for how to get through life's hardest things. I also got certified as a life coach. In the 2 years of writing that book, I had an opportunity to go on tour in Japan as a choreographer. Bucket list. Happening to me at 40 years old with 2 kids. Unheard of, right? Miracles, 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 because I was leaning into my grief, which was terrifying. I have never had such severe pain as I have had walking through this type of grief. And there's been plenty of it in my life. After I went on tour as a choreographer, the artist was like, "Can you sing?" I'm like, "Kinda." It was kind of something I wanted to do, and I was young, but I haven't done it in 20 years. And he's like, "We should make music together." So I started making original music. He let me perform with him in LA when he had gigs. We performed in Vegas. I eventually got introduced to some really successful musicians in the industry. And I'm currently working on my first album that corresponds directly to the chapters in my book and the stories of my life. I'm in talks of doing a docu-series about this method I've now created called the Strong Heart Method, which is this 12-week container of an entire physical and mental reboot. Should you be ready and willing to do the work? A template for people to build new habits and break bad ones. My life is amazing today, but holy shit, there's a lot that's happened to get me here.
I think you have to live a life to be able to be, you know, an artist. A lot of times, like Jack Kerouac on the road, is this idea
Mm,
that, you do have to experience things. You can't just be stuck in your room. And you could have an imagination, and there are artists that might have been just stuck in their room and they had this wild imagination. But there's something about being a storyteller that you can process what happens to you and what happens around you. It's that, ability to pull the muse.
mm,
And I think every creative person is like, if you can synthesize and use the cathartic nature of art
mm,
to actually tell a story that's universal, that people will understand, because a lot of people have probably gone through what you've gone through, but they didn't know how to put it into words or know how to tell it because they were shame, safety, all kinds of things. And the artist is the one that can get through that. And it may have took you to a certain point to be able to finally, execute and become that artist. But it's like as a Buddhist believes, like you were supposed to, it was supposed to happen, and it really doesn't matter when it happened, but it was supposed to happen. So eventually, it was gonna happen. It's like you might have wanted it to happen earlier, but it happened when it was supposed to happen.
yes, and to that exact point, no one could have ever paid me enough money to say, with the death of your sister, you will hereby grant yourself permission to fully live, and every single thing you've ever wanted will come to fruition. I would, not only would I not believe that, I would adamantly reject it.
I rebel against that, the idea
Right?
that, yeah,
That
but it's
those
like,
would be the circumstances under which I would step all the way into my power.
the self-actualize. People self-actualize over time, and it can be triggered by certain traumatic moments, or they can be the whole. I guess the amalgamation of all those moments, and then sometimes it's that critical mass. And if for everyone it's different, what triggers that final push to like, oh, I have permission to finally be me, right? And a lot of times it's like, no, people can tell you that you have permission to do it, but until you believe you actually have it, it won't matter. Until you actually, give yourself the permission, it's not going to happen.
It's so cool because when I think back to 19-year-old Samantha that wanted a record deal, I did love how singing and dancing made me feel, but the pursuit of it was so I could be loved in return.
Hmm.
And here I am, one of I absolutely love coaching people one-on-one. I think there's something so sacred about one-on-one work and that level of connection. Other than the coaching practice, because I have so many ways for people to access me that are so cost effective, programs I've designed, whether it's fitness or mental health programs, my book, right? There are ways to work with me outside of the coaching. But the other thing I'm in deep pursuit of is being a successfully paid public speaker.
Mm-hmm.
And in an effort to jumpstart that, among many things that I'm doing, I started my own speaking event. And I'm not going to just start your ordinary speaking event. It is a great speaking event meets a live concert.
Oh, well, you're kind of hybrid, hybrid event.
Right. And so, this Saturday, it's called Heart Conscious Creators. So anyone can come who's consciously creating the life of their dreams. You could be an artist, an entrepreneur, it doesn't matter. And there are great speakers there. I am one of them, but there is also amazing entertainment, and I am one of the people entertaining, right? So when I give my keynote at the end of it, I sing.
That's cool.
Right?
So it's kind of like a collective event. Just,
Yes.
how you can, if you go to see these big, well, being a musician, it's easier to go with a bunch of bands and take over a club than to try to be the one band to get in the
Yep.
club. So if you come with a collective of authors to go and
Exactly.
have a book symposium or written word symposium or a group of public speakers or like your hybrid event, speaking and music or art. You could have artists displaying pieces of work.
Yep.
Like a happening, like Warhol used to have these happenings. We need to have poets, actors, painters, just any kind of artist, along with Lou Reed, and they would just all be in these events in New York, and I think that's always being an artist, I like, yeah, that's what I want. I want something. I want to give people a way to express themselves, and maybe it's varied. And I always find it's more interesting if it's varied, just from my
Yes.
view.
I think the coolest thing is that, here I am, a grown woman, finding myself back on a stage with a microphone. And the difference is I love myself today. And
You
I,
don't need
I don't
people to love
need
you.
anybody's validation.
Yeah.
I'm just here to serve.
We kind of went full circle to like getting back to like the purest kind of point of art is like you do it because you love it. And then the law of attraction is the people that love what you do will show up. And it's not that you actually, you don't need validation from them because you already validate self-validation. You just wanted that thing to happen because that thing to happen is going to be a very positive event and there's going to be a lot of good energy and everybody's going to be like in the right key and the right tune. They're like, if you're around people like that, you're going to get opportunities. If you have a thing like that, it's going to breed additional opportunities. It's going to breed other collaborations. That's why you want things like this to happen,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's such an interesting place that I'm in right now, right? Because for these 2 years, my husband's business was doing so well that he really cradled me financially and emotionally through the grief so I could write this book and run around in Japan and go on tour and just heal in between bouts of grief through joy, which is a metric by which I live today. It's got to be truthful and it's got to be joyful, or I'm not interested. And that became really clear after I lost my sister. And now it's Samantha putting her business hat back on. It is like, who am I going to serve today?
Well, you got alignment in your microcosm and your macrocosm. and because like you're able to solve your marital issues and be in alignment, and then alignment with yourself, alignment with your spouse, and then alignment with the world, right? So then now you can present yourself to the world without having the hangups and having the all the issues that we're not allowing you to actualize.
Yep.
Because a lot of times we build these walls, we build glass ceilings, we build like why we can't do something, or instead of like why can't I do it?
Yep.
And if you once you get to that place where like it's expansive, anything's possible, right? And I always felt like the old blues guys, like I'm not going to stop till I'm not here. It's not. It's like music isn't just a young person's game. I can keep on. I can play Delta blues until I'm not here. You know, you could be
Exactly.
in New Orleans playing jazz until you're done. It's like it's never done.
That's right.
You don't have to think you're done. It's like on the time continuum. It's like if you're still feeling that you have something to say, then say it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm glad that you found that. You found like joy in it. That you still have the joy in it, because that's the magic of art. Like the fact that you have that joy, and it's infectious. Like other people, you want them to feel it too.
Oh yeah. I mean, God, when that artist I went on tour with gave me a microphone for the first time in 20 years when we were at a gig, the really amazing thing was that I wasn't afraid to fuck up, but I didn't know how it would go.
Mhm.
And I'm not a trained singer. I've done a lot of training in the last 2 years. I'm just a raw talent, right?
Yeah, you got
So
the raw.
there's a lot to learn still. And so I just thought, well, I literally have nothing to lose and everything to gain. And the best part was that I wasn't anxious at all. I loved it. And when I used to try and sing back in the day, I mean, I was in a girl group for a little bit. All the auditions I went on that required singing, my voice would shake and crack because I was such a shell of who I am today. I was just so unsturdy on the inside, and it reflected in my voice. I don't get nervous when I sing. That alone, the fact that I could revisit singing again when I thought those days were totally done and have that as my experience is amazing, let alone the joy it brings me and then it brings to others, right?
Mhm.
Just talk about a bucket list thing in my life that I didn't even know I wanted.
Well, when you actually trust yourself, when you start to, and it's hard. Like when you're the younger, like some younger people, phenoms, they can have that level of trust. Somehow they get it, and and even though I've run into a lot of artists, no matter what, they have that stage fright, and eventually it passes, but it's usually still a little bit there. But there's a certain point where like you just get over it, and then it becomes like it's just pure joy. And he's like this, I just can't wait to be on a stage.
Yeah.
That I don't like have anxiety all day about the hour I'm going to be on stage, and all day I'm freaking out until I get there. There's like some kind of when you can have that kind of calm. It's like you were doing Tai Chi and you weren't doing Tai Chi.
Mm.
It's like you don't have it. It's like at some point you got past it, and then now you don't. Now you can actually live without freaking out.
Yeah. And if you think about it, right, it also goes full circle back to perfectionism, which is really just a shield for vulnerability. Because if you're perfect, you don't have to be messy and make a mistake. So the fact that I was always going into singing, wanting to be perfect,
Hmm.
and I've shattered that idea as an idea I live by, right? Every time I'm trying to control something now, I actually know, uh-oh, you're in fear. You're really scared about something that you can't see or predict or know for sure. So how do you love on yourself and nurture that fear instead of trying to double down on what you can control. So because I've had so much practice in my recovery, and by the way, I say this a lot, perfection is so good culturally. You can accomplish a lot, but it collapses in matters of the heart. There was no amount of perfect that healed me from the betrayal of my husband's affair. There was no amount of perfect that stopped my miscarriages or the death of my dad or the loss of my sister. I've had a lot of practice surrendering and being comfortable in the not knowing. Losing someone you love is hard. Singing on a microphone is not.
Yeah, you have to kind of start to weigh things. Being a cancer survivor myself, one thing that helped me break through my fear was when I survived at age 27, my level 3 sarcoma. I said, why should I be scared
Mm,
of being on a microphone? If I can survive cancer, what am I scared about? And I lived in Japan for 2 years. It's like, so why would I be scared about travel? And so sometimes you have to have something happen. Not that everybody has to have cancer or deaths or traumatic events,
right.
but when you go through life, there are lessons that can be learned. And if you learn how to deal with the triggers and deal with the failures or the happy accidents and see things as opportunities,
Mm,
because a lot of times in the arts is like some of the worst things that ever happen that actually create some of the greatest art,
yep.
right? Because you're able to process it and figure out how to pull beauty out of sadness or beauty out of unhappiness or chaos, and then show people that there is another day. It doesn't have to be the end. And so I think that's like the nature of being an artist. Once you realize like you have that and you can bring that, you should be just happy that you can do that every day. Every day you can do it is an opportunity.
Absolutely. I mean, I really do. I love myself and I love my life today. And I think that's really powerful, for people listening who are in one of those really tough spots or just have a bunch of pain points in their lives. I get it. I really do. I've really been where you are and I'll be there again. Grief doesn't discriminate. Heartbreak doesn't discriminate. We're all going to go through these things where there's no clear roadmap about how to get to the other side of them. But we can, and we do. You just have to do the work. You have to be brave enough to go all the way into the dark so you can find your light again.
Yeah, you have to kind of embrace it. But I want to mention that we hadn't talked about your website, drsamanthahart.com. But
Mm.
we're like the hour always goes by quicker than I can ever imagine, and we actually hit it. But if people will be able to click on your URL, and if they do, is that how they can connect with your practice and your therapy?
Yes, you'll see so many things, all the things I'm doing are on the website, but right at the front is book a discovery call. So, I mean, I would love to connect with
Mhm.
people, especially people who hear my story at this level. Even if you don't want to do work together, that's a great way to reach me. And Instagram, I'm really active on. It's the same thing at Dr. Samantha Hart. So any which way people want to connect and or work with me, those are two great ways to find
And
me.
that's fully clickable. We're just live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. Within the podcast description, that URL is clickable. As soon as we're off the air, it will be clickable on those platforms. And we will be on all the platforms where you can listen to or watch a podcast by tomorrow, like Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon, a lot of other ones. So people will be able to look out for it. But I want to thank you for being a guest. You had a really heartfelt discussion, and we got to hear your voice and hear everything you've gone through. And that's why we do these podcasts live, so we can
Mhm.
have that kind of authentic nature of a voice telling their story. So thank you very much for giving that to our audience tonight.
Oh, I'm so, so thankful to do it.
Thank you. Have a great night.
You too.